The night was heavy over Mississippi in December of 1876. The cotton fields stood quiet, but the silence was uneasy, broken only by the hiss of the winter wind moving through the stalks. In the distance, the muffled thunder of horses' hooves pressed closer, echoing against the wooden shacks where families huddled in the dark. For those who had once lived as slaves, freedom had been promised just a decade earlier. But on this night, freedom came to collect its price in blood. This is the story of the Vicksburg Slave Quarter Massacre, an atrocity that unfolded in the shadow of America's broken Reconstruction. Hundreds of black men, women, and children would lose their lives in a wave of violence so brutal, so deliberate, that it should have carved itself into the nation's memory forever. And yet, most Americans have never even heard of it. Why? Why is it that some battles, like Gettysburg or Antietam, are etched into textbooks and monuments, while massacres like Vicksburg are pushed into silence? Why do we celebrate the promise of freedom but erase the blood that paid for it? To answer that, we must return to the Mississippi of the 1870s, a place where the Civil War was over, but the war for power was far from finished. Reconstruction had granted black men the right to vote, to own land, to govern. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed within reach. But freedom sparked fear, and fear ignited hatred. White supremacist groups, determined to crush this fragile democracy, turned to terror as their weapon. Vicksburg became their stage, once a proud Confederate stronghold, now a city where freedmen outnumbered their former masters. It was a place both symbolic and dangerous. In 1876, the very year Americans celebrated 100 years of independence, Mississippi became the front line in a battle over whose freedom truly mattered. What happened in Vicksburg was not an accident. It was not chaos. It was planned, executed, and defended as necessary. Armed white mobs descended upon black quarters, surrounding homes, dragging families into the night, and leaving behind a silence so deep that even history turned away. This video will walk you through that night and everything that led to it, the fear, the propaganda, the politics, the betrayal of justice. But it will also uncover the human side, the lives interrupted, the dreams erased, the children who never saw adulthood. Because the Vicksburg Massacre is more than a footnote. It is a mirror, a reminder of how fragile freedom is when hate goes unchecked, and how easily rights can be stripped when violence replaces democracy. So tonight, we open a forgotten chapter. We step into the shadows of 1876 to hear the echoes of those whose voices were silenced. And we ask a simple, haunting question. If freedom cost this much, why has America worked so hard to forget it? When the guns fell silent in 1865, Mississippi did not find peace. The war had ended, but the soil was still wet with blood, and the social order that had upheld slavery for centuries was in ruins. For the formerly enslaved, freedom was not simply the absence of chains, it was the terrifying, fragile beginning of life in a world where the law no longer guaranteed their bondage, but hatred still stalked every step. Imagine the first years of Reconstruction in Mississippi. Families that had lived under the whip now walked the same fields as free laborers. Some carried government papers declaring their freedom. Others clutched the hope that the promises of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment would finally give their children what they had been denied the chance to read, to own land, to speak without fear of the lash. But freedom in Mississippi was freedom under siege. The old slaveholding class, stripped of wealth and pride, seethed with humiliation. Defeat at the hands of the Union Army had cut deep, but what stung even more was watching former slaves now casting ballots, some even holding office. In the decade after the Civil War, Mississippi saw black men elected to local councils, county positions, even the state legislature. It was a revolution unthinkable just years before. To many white Southerners, this was nothing less than an apocalypse. They called it Negro domination, a phrase that carried both their fear and their refusal to accept equality. Groups of white men began to organize, first in secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan, later in more open militias that promised to redeem the South. Their methods were clear: night raids, lynchings, intimidation at the ballot box, and massacres disguised as riots. And yet, amid this terror, the black community of Mississippi did not surrender easily. Churches sprang up as centers of hope and resistance. Schools were founded by missionaries and freedmen determined to teach the next generation to read. Land was purchased, small farms established, marriages once forbidden under slavery now legally recognized. For a brief, flickering moment, Reconstruction in Mississippi looked like the dawn of a new South. But the old South did not die quietly. White planters pushed black laborers into contracts that resembled slavery, under another name, sharecropping, where families worked land they did not own, trapped in cycles of debt. Violence was woven into this system, ensuring that freedom never became true independence. The political climate grew darker each year. Federal troops had been stationed across the South to enforce Reconstruction laws, but their numbers dwindled as Northern politicians lost interest. By the mid-1872, Mississippi had become one of the fiercest battlegrounds. White militias, known as rifle clubs, openly patrolled towns and plantations. Their mission was clear: suppress black political power by any means necessary. By 1875, the so-called Mississippi Plan was in full force, a campaign of intimidation and bloodshed designed to overthrow Republican governments that depended on black votes. Public rallies turned violent. Polling stations were surrounded by armed men. Entire communities were warned not to vote or face the consequences. The strategy worked. White Democrats regained power across the state. And still, Vicksburg stood out. It was not just another Southern town, it was a symbol. During the Civil War, its siege and fall in 1863 had marked the Confederacy's death spiral. Now, in the years after the war, it was a place where freedmen outnumbered whites, where the promise of black political power was at its strongest. To redeemer Democrats, Vicksburg was not simply a city to control, it was a threat to be crushed. In these years, the atmosphere of Mississippi was like a dry field waiting for a spark. Every interaction between freedmen and their former masters carried the weight of centuries. A black man walking confidently down a street, a black voter standing in line, a black farmer refusing to be cheated. Each of these acts, ordinary to us, was seen as rebellion by those who longed for the old order. This is the Mississippi in which the Vicksburg Massacre would take place. A land caught between two futures. One future was fragile but radiant, the vision of a multiracial democracy rising from the ashes of slavery. The other was vicious and familiar, the resurrection of white supremacy, cloaked in law and enforced by terror. By 1876, the choice between those futures was no longer being debated in legislatures or newspapers. It was being decided in the streets, in the fields, and in the blood of the innocent. And in Vicksburg, the decision would come violently, leaving behind not a debate, but a massacre. Vicksburg was more than just another town on the Mississippi River. It was a symbol carved into the nation's memory. During the Civil War, Union cannons had pounded its hills for 47 relentless days. The siege ended on the 4th of July, 1863, with the Confederacy surrendering a fortress once thought unbreakable. For the South, Vicksburg was humiliation. For the North, it was triumph. And for the freed people who lived in its shadow, it became a fragile promise that the old world was gone forever. But by 1876, that promise was cracking. Vicksburg had rebuilt itself into a bustling river city, its docks crowded with steamboats carrying cotton, lumber, and grain. The scars of war still lingered in broken buildings and unmarked graves. Yet, the deeper wound was social, not physical. Freedmen made up the majority of Warren County's population, surrounding Vicksburg with farms and quarters where black families worked, prayed, and dreamed of a new life. Their sheer numbers gave them political power votes that could shape elections and secure representation. For many white residents, this was intolerable. They remembered Vicksburg not as a city of surrender, but as a city of pride, a place where their fathers and brothers had bled for the Confederacy. To see black men now holding office, black voters lining up at polling stations, and black churches thriving, it was, in their eyes, an insult layered on defeat. The political climate in 1876 only sharpened this resentment. The nation was in the throes of one of the most contested presidential elections in history. Rutherford B. Hayes for the Republicans, Samuel Tilden for the Democrats. In the South, every local race mattered, because the balance of national power hinged on whether black citizens could vote freely. In Mississippi, especially in Vicksburg, the stakes were life or death. Tension was everywhere. Newspapers became weapons, spreading rumors of black uprisings and painting white vigilantes as defenders of civilization. Merchants refused credit to freedmen who supported Republicans. Employers threatened to cut off wages if workers dared to vote against Democratic candidates. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Neighbors watched neighbors, and whispers of violence spread through the streets like wildfire. In the heart of the city, leaders on both sides prepared for confrontation. On one side stood black community leaders, pastors, teachers, local officials who urged their people to stand firm, to claim the rights promised by the Constitution. In one small church, a minister preached that to surrender the ballot was to surrender God's gift of freedom itself. His voice rang out over the wooden pews, igniting both hope and dread among his congregation. On the other side were the Redeemers, white Democrats determined to redeem the South from Republican control. Among them were former Confederate officers, wealthy planters, and young men raised on stories of lost glory. They formed rifle clubs, drilled in public, and marched through streets as a show of force. One Vicksburg newspaper praised these men as patriots, claiming they were saving the city from Negro misrule. The divide was not abstract. It lived in the daily rhythm of the city. In the marketplace, a freedwoman buying flour might be stared down by white men who muttered that her place was still in chains. On the docks, a black laborer might unload cotton under the watchful eyes of armed rifle clubs standing just yards away. Even children felt it. In neighborhoods where black and white homes stood side by side, parents warned their sons and daughters not to cross invisible lines that could spark a fight or worse. And yet, in the midst of this tension, there was also resilience. Black families continued to gather in quarters just outside the city limits. Small wooden cabins clustered together, where the smell of cornbread mixed with the sound of hymns sung late into the night. For them, Vicksburg was not just a city of danger. It was also a place of possibility. A place where, if freedom could truly take root, their children might inherit a world different from the one their ancestors had endured. But freedom in Vicksburg was fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. Each election brought new threats. Each rumor of violence sent waves of fear through the quarters. By the fall of 1876, armed white patrols were so common that freedmen began holding secret meetings, debating how to protect themselves. Should they resist with weapons, or would that only bring slaughter? In the weeks before December, the atmosphere grew unbearable. A spark was all it would take, and in Vicksburg, that spark was already glowing. By late 1876, Vicksburg was like dry tinder, waiting for a single match. The air was heavy with suspicion, and both black and white residents knew that something was coming. What they did not know was how violent, how merciless, the storm would be once it broke. At the heart of the crisis was politics. Reconstruction had created an unprecedented shift. Formerly enslaved men now held the ballot, and in counties like Warren, where black citizens outnumbered whites, this meant real power. Local offices, juries, even the sheriff's seat could no longer be taken for granted by white elites. To them, this was an unbearable reversal of the order they had always known. The Democratic Party in Mississippi, dominated by Redeemers, was determined to crush this experiment in multiracial democracy. Their strategy was known as the Mississippi Plan, a systematic campaign of intimidation, propaganda, and violence aimed at driving black voters away from the polls. In towns across the state, rifle clubs paraded through black neighborhoods, newspapers published lurid tales of Negro insurrections, and mobs attacked Republican leaders. By the fall of 1876, the plan was working. Democratic victories were piling up, and federal troops could no longer intervene without sparking national crisis. In Vicksburg, the situation was especially tense. Local elections had produced a fragile balance of power. Some black officials held positions in county government, supported by Republican voters, but their authority was constantly challenged. Every decision, every attempt to enforce the law was met with accusations of corruption or incompetence. White leaders insisted that only Democrats could restore order, and they were willing to prove it with guns if necessary. The atmosphere of fear was carefully cultivated. Rumors spread through taverns and newspapers that armed groups of black men were plotting an uprising. Stories circulated that freedmen were hoarding weapons in their quarters, preparing to march on the city. In truth, most black families owned nothing more than hunting rifles or old muskets, if that. Their greatest weapon was the ballot box. But in the white imagination, these rumors served as justification for preemptive violence. One spark came in early December, when a dispute between a black deputy sheriff and a white citizen escalated into a deadly confrontation. Accounts differ on the details. Some say the deputy acted in self-defense. Others claim he abused his power. But the result was the same. White leaders seized on the incident as proof that black authority could not be tolerated. Meetings were called. Resolutions passed. Armed patrols began organizing openly under the guise of protecting Vicksburg from an imminent black revolt. The stage was set by both propaganda and politics. Nationally, the presidential election of 1876 was still unresolved. Hayes and Tilden both claimed victory, and the entire country was on edge. For white redeemers in Mississippi, this uncertainty was an opportunity. If they could demonstrate that Reconstruction governments were unworkable, that black political power meant chaos, then Northern politicians would be more willing to abandon the South to self-rule, and self-rule meant white rule. Economic tensions added fuel to the fire. Sharecropping had trapped black families in cycles of debt, but many still managed to hold on to small pieces of land or independence. This independence enraged planters who wanted cheap, controllable labor. The massacre that was coming would not only break political will, it would also serve as a warning. Step out of line, and your land, your life, your future could be taken in a single night. For black residents, the dilemma was agonizing. Some community leaders argued for resistance, saying that to give in was to surrender freedom itself. Others counseled caution, fearing that any show of defiance would be used as an excuse for slaughter. In the churches and quarters around Vicksburg, families whispered late into the night, asking one another the same question: should we fight or should we flee? But fleeing was not truly an option. Where could they go? Mississippi was saturated with violence. The federal government, once a source of protection, was retreating, and neighbors who had once been merely hostile now marched in uniformed rifle clubs, armed and ready. The causes of the massacre were not a single spark, but a chain reaction: political fear, racial hatred, economic greed, and the deliberate use of terror as a tool. Each day in late 1876 added another link to that chain, until it was pulled tight around the neck of Vicksburg's black community. By the second week of December, the die was cast. White militias were mobilizing under the banner of restoring order. Black citizens, outnumbered and outgunned, braced themselves for the worst. And in the dark quarters outside the city, mothers prayed that the rumors were wrong, that the thunder of hooves would pass them by. But the thunder was real, and it was already moving toward them. The night fell heavy on the 6th of December, 1876. In the slave quarters outside Vicksburg, small fires flickered inside cabins where families tried to find warmth. Mothers rocked children to sleep. Men sat quietly after long days of labor, some speaking in hushed tones about the rumors that had haunted them for weeks. They had heard whispers of white militias forming, of rifles being polished, of meetings held in secret. But rumors were constant in Mississippi. No one could yet imagine the scale of the terror that was about to descend. Just after midnight, the silence broke. Hoofbeats thundered against the dirt roads, growing louder with every second. Dozens, then hundreds, of mounted white men appeared out of the darkness, rifles slung across their shoulders, torches blazing in their hands. Some wore remnants of Confederate gray, others the black coats of rifle clubs. Their faces were set, hard and cold, as if they had come not to fight enemies but to exterminate pests. The first cabins were surrounded quickly. Windows shattered as men broke through doors, dragging terrified families into the night. Shots cracked, the silence sharp, merciless, echoing across the quarters. Screams followed, high-pitched and desperate, carrying into the fields. Flames rose as torches were hurled onto thatched roofs. Within minutes, what had been a cluster of wooden homes became a battlefield. Inside one cabin, a mother tried to hide her children beneath a straw mattress. She whispered for them not to move, not to cry. As boots crashed through the doorway, a shot rang out, and the last thing she heard was her children screaming her name. In another, an old man clutched a worn Bible to his chest, praying aloud as the militia dragged him outside. His voice was drowned by laughter and gunfire. The assault was not random. It was coordinated. Armed bands swept methodically through the quarters, moving from house to house. Some freedmen tried to resist, firing rusty muskets or hunting rifles into the night. A few white riders fell, but retaliation was swift and overwhelming. Entire cabins of men were executed on the spot, their bodies left sprawled in the mud as warnings to others. The terror was indiscriminate. Women were not spared. Children were not spared. Even the elderly, too frail to flee, were cut down. Survivors later described the massacre as if the very earth had turned against them, fire above, bullets around, and no place left to run. By dawn, smoke hung over the quarters like a funeral shroud. The rising sun revealed a landscape of devastation. Cabins burned to ash, bodies strewn in ditches and fields, families torn apart. Estimates of the dead varied. Some newspapers reported dozens, others hundreds. In the black community, whispers told of as many as 300 lives erased in a single night. The exact number would never be known, because the truth itself was buried alongside the victims. Those who survived carried scars deeper than wounds. A young boy who crawled into the swamp to escape returned to find his parents gone, their home reduced to embers. A woman who fled into the woods wandered for days before finding her church burned and her neighbors missing. Survivors spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all, fearing that even to remember out loud might invite more violence. And in the city of Vicksburg, the morning after, there was no justice, no arrests, no trials. White newspapers reported the massacre as a necessary action to prevent black insurrection. Some praised the rifle clubs as heroes who had defended civilization. The dead were blamed for their own deaths, their supposed rebellion cited as justification for the slaughter. The silence was perhaps the most chilling part. The massacre had not been hidden. The smoke could be seen for miles. The gunshots heard across the city. But to acknowledge it as murder would mean admitting the fragility of the new democracy. Instead, officials looked away. Federal authorities, embroiled in the disputed presidential election, refused to intervene. The bodies of the dead were left to be buried quietly, without ceremony, without names recorded. For the black community of Vicksburg, the massacre was not just a night of horror. It was the end of a fragile dream. The message was unmistakable. Freedom might exist on paper, but white supremacy still ruled with fire and blood. Years later, old men and women would still speak of that night in hushed tones. They would recall the flames that lit the sky, the sound of hooves pounding like thunder, the cries that would not fade from their memory. They would tell their grandchildren, not as history written in books, but as a warning. This is what hatred can do when left unchecked. The massacre was not chaos. It was not accident. It was deliberate, planned, executed, and celebrated by those who believed violence was the only way to restore their power. And it worked. The community was shattered, its leaders silenced, its will broken. The night of horror in Vicksburg was more than a massacre. It was a turning point. The fragile promise of Reconstruction crumbled in the smoke of those burning cabins, and the path to Jim Crow was paved not just with laws, but with the blood of the innocent. Morning broke over Vicksburg on the 7th of December, 1876, but it was not a dawn of justice. The city rose to the acrid smell of smoke, the hushed whispers of survivors, and the cold silence of authorities who refused to speak the truth. What had happened in the quarters was not hidden. The fires had lit up the night sky, the gunshots had echoed across the hills, and the dead lay in plain sight. Yet by sunrise, the massacre was already being rewritten not as a crime, but as an act of order. Local newspapers carried the Redeemer version of events. Headlines warned of a Negro uprising allegedly thwarted by brave white citizens. Articles claimed that black men had plotted to seize Vicksburg, to burn the city and murder its white inhabitants. The massacre, they said, was not an atrocity, but a preemptive defense. And for much of the white public, both in Mississippi and beyond, this lie was easier to accept than the uncomfortable truth. The reality was simpler and darker. The massacre had achieved its political purpose. By eliminating opposition, terrorizing voters, and silencing community leaders, the Redeemers secured their control of Warren County. In the elections that followed, black turnout plummeted. Men who had once stood proudly in line to cast their ballots now stayed home, knowing that a vote might cost them their lives. The rifle clubs had succeeded where speeches and policies could not. They had destroyed the possibility of black political power in Vicksburg. This was not an isolated event. Across Mississippi, 1876 became the year of redemption. Not redemption in the biblical sense, but in the language of white supremacy. The Democratic Party, guided by the Mississippi Plan, swept back into power, displacing Republican governments that had depended on freedmen's votes. Intimidation was systematic, violence was celebrated, and the message was clear. The age of Reconstruction was ending. At the national level, the timing was crucial. The presidential election of 1876 was deadlocked. Democrat Samuel Tilden had won the popular vote, but Republican Rutherford B. Hayes contested the results in several states, including South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi. The nation teetered on the edge of another civil war, not of armies, but of ballots and courts. In this fragile moment, federal authorities were unwilling to intervene in Southern violence. To challenge the Redeemers in Mississippi would have meant reigniting the very conflict the country was desperate to move beyond. The massacre in Vicksburg, then, became part of a larger bargain. In early 1877, the compromise that resolved the election handed the presidency to Hayes, but at a cost. Federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction would end, and with their departure, black citizens were left defenseless against the rule of white Democrats who wasted no time cementing their control. For the survivors of Vicksburg, the aftermath was suffocating. Families who had lost fathers, mothers, or children now lived under the very men who had slaughtered them. To speak of the massacre was dangerous. To seek justice was impossible. Courts were controlled by Redeemers. Sheriffs and judges turned a blind eye. The state government declared itself restored to home rule, meaning white rule, and Washington looked the other way. Socially, the massacre sent shockwaves through the black community. Churches that had once been filled with hope now echoed with grief. Schools, once symbols of progress, struggled to remain open as families fled the county in fear. Many who stayed moved deeper into silence, choosing survival over resistance. An entire generation grew up under the shadow of that night, learning that freedom could vanish with the strike of a match and the pull of a trigger. For white redeemers, the message was triumphant. They paraded their victory as proof that Reconstruction had failed, that black citizens were unfit for self-government, and that the South must be redeemed. They celebrated in newspapers, on courthouse steps, and in political rallies. The massacre was not condemned. It was absorbed into the narrative of white resurgence. Historians would later describe 1876 as the year Reconstruction died. But for those who lived in Vicksburg, it was more personal. It was the year their dreams of democracy were buried alongside the bodies of their families. The year the promise of freedom was revealed to be conditional, fragile, and easily revoked. The massacre's political consequences extended far beyond Warren County. By destroying black political participation in Mississippi, it helped ensure the success of the Democratic Party statewide, and Mississippi's model of redemption was copied across the South. The method was simple: suppress the black vote through violence, justify it with propaganda, and solidify it with legal control. Within a decade, this system would evolve into the rigid laws of Jim Crow, locking black Southerners into second-class citizenship for nearly a century. Yet in 1876, no one called it Jim Crow. They called it peace. They called it order. They called it the natural way of things. And behind those words lay the ashes of the Vicksburg quarters, where freedom had been tested and betrayed. The political and social aftermath of the massacre was not merely about one community. It was about the death of an experiment, the attempt to build a multiracial democracy on the ruins of slavery. In the embers of Vicksburg, that experiment burned out, and the darkness that followed would stretch across generations. When the gunfire ceased and the ashes cooled, the massacre did not end. Its violence lived on in silence. What happened in Vicksburg in December 1876 was not merely a killing, it was an erasure. The survivors, those who limped away from the burning cabins, carried memories too dangerous to speak. In the months that followed, many avoided even whispering about that night. To tell the truth was to risk another attack, another round of vengeance. Children were warned. Never mention what you saw. Never repeat what you heard. Silence became survival. And in that silence, memory began to fade. Not because the wounds healed, but because speaking them aloud was forbidden. The official records reflected this erasure. Local authorities filed no charges, produced no investigations. Court dockets remained empty of cases connected to the massacre. To the law, it was as if nothing had happened. Instead, newspapers framed the violence as restoration of order, a necessary action against a fabricated black rebellion. These false narratives hardened into the public record, while the voices of the victims were locked out. The erasure extended beyond Vicksburg. In state histories written in the late 19th century, the massacre was reduced to a line or omitted entirely. Schoolchildren in Mississippi learned of the siege of Vicksburg during the Civil War, but not the slaughter that followed a decade later. Teachers spoke of Confederate valor, Union victory, and Reconstruction, corruption, but not of torches lighting up the slave quarters. A generation grew up knowing the mythology of the South, but not the truth of its terror. Why was it forgotten? Partly because it was designed to be. White redeemers, having regained political power, controlled which stories were told and which were buried. To admit to a massacre would have stained their victory. To celebrate redemption, they needed silence about the blood that purchased it, and so they silenced it, not with laws alone, but with a collective refusal to remember. Yet the silence was never complete. In black families, stories whispered from grandparents to children kept fragments of memory alive. An old man might tell his grandson about the night the riders came, his voice dropping low so the neighbors would not hear. A grandmother might recall the hymn she heard her mother singing just before the flames consumed their cabin. These were not entries in history books, but living testimonies, fragile and trembling, carried in the hearts of those who refused to let the dead vanish completely. Even so, Decades passed. By the early 20th century, Jim Crow laws had hardened across the South. Segregation was enforced with iron precision, and lynchings dotted the landscape as constant reminders of white supremacy. In such a climate, who would dare to resurrect the memory of Vicksburg 1876? Better to bury it deeper, to let it rot in unmarked graves, than to risk punishment for remembering. Historians who studied Reconstruction often focused on political battles in Washington, on the Compromise of 1877, on the larger sweep of national history, the local massacres, the intimate horrors visited upon communities like Vicksburg, were often relegated to footnotes. Scholars in the North sometimes accepted the Redeemer's narrative that Reconstruction had failed because of corruption and incompetence, not because of terrorism. And so the silence was not only Southern, it spread into the national story, shaping how Americans remembered their own past. It was only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries that researchers began piecing together the fragments. Archival records, oral histories, forgotten newspaper clippings, each provided glimpses of the truth. Scholars and activists asked the question that had been avoided for a century. How could such an atrocity vanish from the national memory? How many other massacres lay buried under layers of silence? In Vicksburg itself, the struggle to remember was ongoing. Some descendants of survivors pressed for recognition, for memorials, for public acknowledgement. Others hesitated, fearing backlash even generations later. The silence had lasted so long it had become second nature, woven into the fabric of community life. To break it required courage, not just to face the past, but to challenge the present. The comparison with other massacres sharpened the wound. Americans learned about the Colfax Massacre of 1873, where dozens of black men were slaughtered in Louisiana. They read about Hamburg in South Carolina, where rifle clubs killed black militia members during that same fateful summer of 1876. Yet Vicksburg often went unnamed, a ghost in the archive. It was as if the city's own legacy, the Great Civil War siege of 1863, overshadowed the horror that followed, making it easier to commemorate military heroism than racial terror. The silence was not accidental. It was deliberate. To forget was to absolve. To forget was to allow white supremacy to declare itself not a regime of violence, but a return to normal. Forgetting made possible the smooth transition from massacre to Jim Crow, from bloodshed to law, without ever acknowledging the cost. But memory is stubborn. The names of the dead may not all be known, but the truth insists on resurfacing. Each new generation of scholars, each descendant who whispers a story passed down, chips away at the silence, and with each telling, the massacre becomes harder to erase. The silence of history is as powerful as the violence that creates it. But silence is not eternal. In remembering Vicksburg, we remember not only the horror of a single night, but the ongoing battle over whose stories are told, whose lives are valued, and whose suffering is acknowledged. History often reduces massacres to numbers: dozens dead, hundreds killed, a community destroyed. But behind every number is a life, and behind every life is a story that ended too soon. To understand Vicksburg 1876, we cannot stop at statistics. We must step closer into the cabins, the fields, and the hearts of those who lived and died there. Take the story of Samuel, a young man in his 20s. He had been born enslaved but grew up with the first flickers of freedom. Neighbors remembered him as someone who taught himself to read by candlelight, tracing letters on scraps of newspaper. His dream, whispered to friends in the quarters, was to become a teacher, to pass on the gift of literacy to children who had been denied it for generations. On the night of the massacre, Samuel tried to shield his younger brother as armed riders broke into their cabin. Both were shot before dawn. His dream of teaching, of lifting others through words, died with him in the mud outside Vicksburg. Or consider Eliza, a mother of 3. She worked the fields by day and sang hymns by night, her voice carrying over the cabins like a soft promise of hope. Her eldest daughter had just begun attending a freedmen's school, learning to write her own name. Eliza often said she wanted her children to have a life with choices, something she had never known. On the 6th of December, Eliza was dragged from her home. Her children survived by hiding beneath a collapsed wall, listening as their mother's voice was silenced. They grew up without her, carrying the memory of that night like a scar that never faded. There was also Isaac, an elder in the community. Too old to flee, he kept a worn Bible by his bed, its pages creased from years of use. Isaac was known for telling children stories from Scripture, reminding them that even in slavery, God's people had found deliverance. On the night of the massacre, he clutched that Bible as rifle fire tore through the walls of his cabin. Neighbors later found him still holding it, his fingers pressed to the words of Exodus. For Isaac, faith was not enough to stop bullets, but it was the last thing he chose to hold. And then, there were the children, countless names we will never know. Boys and girls who had run barefoot through fields, laughed in schoolyards, and fallen asleep to the sound of their mother's songs. In the massacre, they were not spared. Some died in their mother's arms, others in flight. For every child lost, an entire future disappeared. The farmer, who might have tilled his own land, the preacher who might have lifted a congregation, the seamstress who might have built a business, the poet who might have given voice to a people. The tragedy of Vicksburg was not only in the killing but in the silencing of these lives. Each person carried dreams that reached beyond the brutality of their circumstances. They dreamed of ownership, of education, of love and dignity. They dreamed of futures that were brutally erased in a single night. For the survivors, the cost was measured not only in grief, but in the weight of memory. Children grew up haunted by what they saw: the flames, the gunfire, the sudden absence of family. Some carried that trauma silently, never speaking of it, while others passed down fragments of the story in whispers. Entire families were broken apart, their lineage cut short. Communities that might have thrived were reduced to silence and fear. What makes the massacre so devastating is not only the violence of the night itself, but the loss of what could have been. Imagine if Samuel had become a teacher, how many children might he have inspired? If Eliza had lived, what kind of lives might her children have built under her guidance? If Isaac's wisdom had endured, how many might have drawn strength from his faith? Each death was not just a life ended, but a future stolen from a community already fighting for survival. To remember Vicksburg is to remember not just a massacre, but a generation of hopes extinguished. It is to acknowledge that the struggle for freedom was not fought only in battlefields and legislatures, but in cabins and families, where ordinary people dared to dream of more. The human cost of Vicksburg cannot be calculated in numbers. It can only be felt in the stories of lives cut short, in the silence left behind, and in the recognition that these were not faceless victims, but human beings, parents, children, neighbors whose absence reshaped the world around them. In honoring them, we refuse to let the massacre remain a statistic. We give back, in memory, the humanity that was stolen in violence, and in doing so, we resist the silence that has shrouded their names for nearly a century and a half. The Vicksburg Slave Quarter Massacre of 1876 is more than an event buried in the past. It is a reminder, a mirror, and a warning. For too long, it was erased from history books, silenced in classrooms, and ignored in public memory. But silence does not erase truth. The smoke may have vanished from the sky, yet the weight of that night still hangs over America. The legacy of Vicksburg is written in what followed. After the massacre, black political power in Mississippi collapsed. Freedmen, who had once stood proudly to vote, now did so under threat of death or not at all. Churches and schools that had been symbols of hope were overshadowed by fear. And across the South, the Mississippi Plan became a model for suppressing black rights. Within a decade, Jim Crow laws codified the very system of racial domination that violence had secured. The massacre was not an isolated outburst of hatred. It was part of the blueprint for nearly a century of legalized oppression. But the legacy is also human. The names we do not know, the dreams we recounted, the teacher Samuel might have been, the mother Eliza's children might have become, the wisdom Isaac might have passed down. Their absence is a loss that cannot be measured, but it lingers in the generational trauma carried by descendants who still live in Mississippi today. What lessons do we draw? One is the fragility of freedom. Rights, once gained, can be stripped away, if not defended. Reconstruction promised equality under the law, but promises on paper meant little without protection in practice. Vicksburg teaches us that democracy is not self-sustaining. It can be undone with bullets, lies, and silence. Another lesson is about memory. The massacre was forgotten not because it was insignificant, but because, remembering, it was inconvenient. To acknowledge it would have been to admit that white supremacy won not through fairness, but through terror. By burying the memory, society allowed injustice to masquerade as order. That silence itself became a form of violence, erasing the humanity of the victims a second time. Today, as we look back, the act of remembering is an act of resistance. To speak of Vicksburg is to restore dignity to the dead and to challenge the narratives that denied them. It is to say that their lives mattered, that their dreams were real, and that their suffering cannot be erased. We must also see the warning in their story. The forces that led to Vicksburg, fear, propaganda, political calculation, racial hatred, are not relics of the 19th century. They echo in our own time, reminding us how fragile justice remains when truth is manipulated and hate is allowed to fester. The massacre warns us that democracy can fall not only through war, but through silence, indifference, and the rewriting of memory. In the end, the massacre at Vicksburg is not just about what was lost. It is about what we choose to do now. We cannot return life to Samuel, to Eliza, to Isaac, or to the children who perished. But we can carry their memory forward. We can tell their story, honor their humanity, and refuse the silence that once smothered their voices. History is not only about victories and monuments. It is about the lives in between the forgotten, the silenced, the erased. By remembering Vicksburg, we reclaim a chapter that should never have been hidden. And in that act of remembrance, we find a lesson both painful and necessary. Freedom must be guarded, justice must be demanded, and silence must never again be allowed to bury the truth.